Thanks, Kelly, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a very interesting and informative presentation on the brain. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Vincent Kiechlin, and this is his second appearance in our Wednesday webinar lineup. His previous presentation was in August of 2010, and it was on brain balance, the key to movement and behavior, and that webinar is available for download on our website. Dr. Kiechlin is a graduate of St. Peter's College, Los Angeles College of Chiropractic, as well as the Carrick Institute for Graduate Studies in Florida. He is a member of the American Chiropractic Neurology Board, as well as the New Jersey State Board of Chiropractors. He has been practicing chiropractic for 30 years and has been board certified in chiropractic neurology for 17 years.
Thank you, ladies. I hope you all got to see the video. When I first viewed that video, I was amazed that this doctor did what he had done because basically what he did, as you saw, was that he was able to take a collection of cells that he basically dissolved into, just floating free cells, and then he created a network where that petri dish of brain cells could fly, and that experiment has been reproduced many times, and that little petri dish can live for months at a time, and so that was to me a fantastic example of neuroplasticity, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, and that's basically why you have a brain and how it works and how it learns. So just a little overview. We're going to talk about the primary function of the brain. So what's the first thing it always wants to do? The basic working of brain cells, why they communicate with each other, why that's important, and how that function can be changed. We're also going to talk about the basic development of the brain and nervous system and how the development can affect learning, how trauma can affect the brain, such as concussions. It's a very big thing these days. And the role of my profession, chiropractic care, and the relationship in how it changes the nervous system and why that's important, and how I help people basically, and then activities that everyone can do to maintain a healthy brain and nervous system. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the primary function of the brain. If you look at many anatomy textbooks, most of them will say that the primary function of the brain is to control and coordinate all body functions, and it does do that. But the main thing that it does is to know where you are in space and where the objects are around you in space. That is the first thing it does. And to give you a little example, if you ever woke up in a hotel room on vacation or on a trip somewhere and you forgot that you weren't home, for that split second when you wake up, you're startled. Why? Because you didn't know where you were for that split second. It's the first thing your brain does. Okay? So why is that it's so important? Because the reason why we have a brain is in order to move. And you can't move in space if you don't know where you are in space and where the objects are around you. It's the first thing your brain does. So if you've ever been in a dark fun house or something like that, people walk very slowly, not only because they think a scary monster might jump out or something, but because they don't know where they are. They're walking, they don't know where you are in space. So it makes it so much fun, right? So animals that don't move do not have brains and nervous systems. Most sea sponges do not have a brain or nervous system. Their offspring do, because they have to swim around the reef to find a place to live. But as soon as they do find that place to live, they tend to, they will digest their brain and nervous system because they don't need it anymore. So that's very important. Okay. So let's look a little bit at what a basic brain cell looks like. So this would be the cell body. So this is where the brain of the cell is. That's the nucleus in there. That's where the DNA lives, etc. And then you have all these branches that come off the cell. And then you have this long branch that goes out called the axon. So the dendrites receive information from other cells. And then the axon, or the cell body, then processes that information and then sends it on to the next group of cells. And this is a very basic picture of a neuron and understand there are many, many types of neurons. They don't all look like this. And their look really, it constantly changes as you'll see as we go along. But understand there could be as many as 50 to 75,000 connections per cell. So there could be 75,000 of these little arms and branches coming off a cell. Okay. This little guy here, just to point out, if you're wondering what these little hot dog looking sausage guys are, these are fat cells that surround the core neurons, this guy. And what they do is they allow the speed of the signal to go quicker down to the next group of cells at the ends here. So understand, this axon at the tips of these, what's sitting here are dendrites of other cells that are going to go in other directions and so on and so on. So in order to make that signal move quicker, the brain coats the arm with fat. And so that's the signal can jump from hot dog to hot dog, so to speak. And this little guy is called the node of Renvier. And their job is to make the signal go quicker. So people with multiple sclerosis, what happens is these fat cells, they start to degenerate, and then the signal becomes much slower. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about neurons, because understand a neuron is the bricks of the brain. It's what the whole thing is made of. And they're just clumped together in what looks like a big ball of spaghetti, but actually their architecture and their layout is very, very organized. And it's very purposeful. The brain is very purposeful in how it lays down these bricks. So the primary job of a neuron is to survive. So it will survive first. So what does that mean? That means that it will, well, let's look at the secondary job. The secondary job is to transmit and receive information. So a neuron can still be working, or let's put it this way, it can still be alive and able to function, but if it's in survival mode, it won't look that way. It will look dead, because when neurons are functioning, they transmit and receive information. So sometimes neurons don't look like they're working properly, or they look like they're dead almost, or that they're not going to function, when in actuality, they're in survival mode. Oops. Okay. So every time a neuron is stimulated, without being overstimulated, so without having too much stimulation, it creates new genes in the nucleus. So when another neuron talks to those dendrites, let's say, it releases a little chemical that crosses a bridge. I don't want to get too deep into this, but there's a little bridge. It's called a synapse. So the message goes down. Let's go back a little bit. The message comes down this arm, and then these little guys that are at the ends of this for other cells, there's a teeny little space in between. And so these guys will release a little chemical, depending on the cell, that will excite the dendrite of the other cell. And when that happens, they don't show them here, but there's all kinds of doors all over the entire portion of the cell. And when these little messages or these little neurotransmitters touch these dendrites, these doors open, and they allow salty water that surrounds our neurons to enter the cell. And what that does is it changes the charge of the cell, and that's what creates the electrical impulse. And then once that salty water goes in, let's say, we'll just call it salty water for now, then it has to be pumped back out again so the cell can send another message. So you don't want to send in too much water. You don't want to fire too much of this cell too frequently, where too much water gets in, because it's got to pump it out to do it again. So that's what I mean when I say not overstimulated, because once it's stimulated, it has to get rid of that salt water so that it can enter again and change that charge. Okay? So, and every time that happens, that cell makes new genes, and those genes are used as templates for protein replication inside the cell. And understand that everything inside the cell is made of protein, everything, the organelles, the mitochondria, which give energy to the cell that allows it to pump that salty water back out again so it can fire again. So all the DNA, the bridges that hold the nucleus in the middle, all the arms, the dendrites, that long sausagey axon that came all the way out, well, that core of that sausage is all protein. So the cell must make protein. It's how it makes itself and it's how it survives. And it's really how the brain grows when you're an embryo and a baby inside, as in all of us. So, and then there's this constant recreating and restimulating and reactivating of proteins throughout our life and recreation of these genes. Okay, so proteins are then used to create organelles such as mitochondria, which is that powerhouse, as well as branches to other nerve cells. And this is the mechanism by which neuroplasticity occurs. And understand, this is the mechanism that all learning occurs. And not just 2 + 2 = 4, but motor learning, sensory learning, behavioral learning, all learning occurs this way, not just cognitive learning. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, once you make those new genes and you allow that cell to make protein, it can now survive because it has the ability to replicate itself. So now it can grow stronger and then enhance connections to other nerve cells. That is the basis of neuroplasticity. And as I said, all learning is done this way. Okay. So how do we get a nerve cell to become stimulated? Well, through our senses. So we have the basic 5 senses we all learned in grade school. We have sight, we have sound, we have taste, we have smell, and we have touch. Those are all our 5 senses. But all of those 5 combined are only equal to about 5 to 10% of the stimulation to our brains. And why? Because they come and go. They're not all the time. So there's one more. What is the major stimulation to our brain responsible for 90% of all the connections in our head? It comes from gravity. And why? Because gravity is the only stimulation to our brain that is constant. So gravity is pumping our brain constantly. And the 2 main areas that feel gravity, so what parts we know are vision goes through our eyes, smell and taste through our tongue and our nose, touch through our skin and receptors. So what feels gravity? The muscles that resist it, and most of those are in your spine, and then the inner ear system. And the inner ear and the spine are responsible for 90% of the stimulation to your brain because they resist gravity, even when you sleep. Okay, so why so much? Again, because gravity is constant. Okay, so let's look at about the development of the brain. So understand that when you're an embryo inside mommy's belly, it's dark in there. You don't taste or smell anything. You're not really hearing anything. A little bit of mommy's heartbeat and gut sounds, but not very much to grow a brain. So what is growing the brain? It's movement of mommy and gravity. That's it. And the baby's brain is growing billions of nerve cells every day. It's unbelievable. So gravity is the first sense we have, and all the other senses are then stacked on top of it after we're born. And understand that, therefore, they're dependent on how we feel gravity, because they come later. They're stacked on top of that foundational gravity system. Okay, so let's look a little bit at this picture. So this is a little bit advanced, but 3 weeks after conception, the whole foundation of the child's brain and nervous system are already there. 3 weeks after conception. So mommy doesn't even know she's pregnant yet. And the whole, foundation is there already. And then I couldn't find a good picture of it, so I just skipped it. And then this is what happens a little bit later. So it starts off as 3 main bumps. Okay? And then these bumps, as the baby starts to grow, they start to differentiate. And so this whole top bump here, this little bump here, is going to develop into the whole cortex of the brain. And then this little green area called the mesencephalon, this is your prosencephalon, mesencephalon, ramencephalon. And then this mesencephalon is going to get folded over and surrounded by the brain. So this is almost like the knot in the balloon, and then as the brain expands, this area starts to feed up into that area. And this is a main area for dopamine, and we use dopamine for not just movement, Like, well, this is the area of the brain that tends to degenerate in people with movement disorders, such as Parkinson's disease, or Tourette's for that matter. Only with that, it's more of a developmental thing. And then we have the rhombencephalon, which turns into your pons, medulla, and cerebellum. So all these guys. So let's talk a little bit about the rule. So the rule of embryology when it comes to the nervous system is whatever cells are born on the same day will always hold hands till the day you die. No exception to that rule. So going back to that picture, that means that whatever this brain is going to turn into is all going to be connected to itself forever. And so how is it connected? Some of it is through touching, through those synapses I told you about with the dendrites and axons. But the other way it's connected is through timing. And so what do I mean by that? The best way I understood this was, if you think of an orchestra, you have all different instruments. So the brain is like an orchestra. We have all different types of cells that have all different jobs. And just like an orchestra, they do different specific things, like different instruments make specific sounds. But when that conductor waves that wand of his and gets them to different regions of the orchestra to make sounds at a specific time, they can create a totally different sound. And in fact, an infinite number of sounds if you think about it. And so this is how our brain has the ability to have an infinite number of experiences and to do an infinite number of motor activities and really learn an infinite number of things because of that timing thing, because of the way the brain communicates with itself throughout your life. So we have connections through physical connections, through synapses with the dendrites and the axons, and then we have this timing connection, and very important. Both are very critical for a normal brain health. Okay, I hope I explained that well. Okay, whatever cells are born on the same day will always hold hands. I said that. So what senses grow the baby's brain during fetal development? We kind of talked about that already, and I hope you got that. It's gravity and movement of mommy. And you know, the baby's brain is growing like crazy. Okay. So knowing where you are in space in the Earth's gravitational field is the first sense a baby experiences, and gravity becomes the largest stimulation throughout our life. And gravity then affects posture, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But understand that there are certain neurological diseases, etc., that you can pick out and you can almost diagnose based just on gait alone. And there are many studies that have shown that. Okay, so what happens when somebody injures their brain? When the brain is injured, the connections to other cells are disrupted through inflammation and shearings or tearing of the branches between the neurons. So once those neurons swell up and tear, they're no longer usable by the brain, and the brain will snip them. And why would it do that? Because it takes a lot of energy for the brain to maintain a brain cell. Brain cells soak up more sugar than any other part of your body. We have special cells in our brain, in our brainstem rather, that other animals don't have, that ensure that our brain gets enough sugar and oxygen, glucose and oxygen through our blood system, because our brain needs that. It's very, we've all seen what happens when people have strokes. It's devastating to the brain very quickly. So this inflammation and this shearing of the neurons puts them in survival mode, and they look dead. Okay. This connection, and so once we have that lack of communication between the brain cells, then we don't have any more of that new protein replication. So no new genes, no new protein, no new neuroplasticity. We start to reduce our ability to learn. Okay, and it's a very, very common complaint from people in concussions. I used to be a straight A student, and now I'm struggling. So anybody who's ever knows someone who's had it, that's a very common complaint. Okay, so when this occurs, cells then go into survival mode, and as I said, they stop transmitting and receiving information to other cells. So how does my profession fit into this whole whole thing. Why do I study this, and why does this interest me? It's because chiropractic adjustments increase the brain's sensitivity to gravity. So it increases that protein replication, that genetic expression. And the way an adjustment works is once it changes your body's sensitivity to gravity, then going out into gravity and into space promotes that change even further. So really, the way I look at it is the adjustment itself is it's not just the moment you get the adjustment that has the effect. It's really once you leave and go walk in gravity that the greatest effect or the greatest change occurs. Okay, and hopefully you understand how that fits into everything I've explained so far. Okay, so because of that, chiropractic adjustments increase communication between brain cells. They increase genetic expression, especially in the cerebellum, because that's the first stop on the way up to the brain. That the messages. There's receptors in our spinal muscles, and what's interesting, one of them is called the muscle spindle. It has the largest influence of the brain than all other receptors in the body. And what's really amazing about this receptor is it's the only receptor in our body whose sensitivity can be changed. So all other receptors in our body are constant. They fire at a set rate into the brain. While the muscle spindle is different. It is reset through the brain itself. So the brain has a way to regulate how much gravity it wants to feel and how much it can take. And when these receptors start to dysfunction, then people start having troubles resisting and feeling gravity. So it increases the brain's ability to strengthen its connections, and of course it would enhance neuroplasticity in the brain. Okay. So how can we do on our own, make our brain stronger? The rule that I have found for stimulating the brain that I use in my practice and helping my patients, and just in my own exercise routine, is that frequent activity for short duration promotes the greatest neuroplasticity. So walking upright on two limbs is one of the best ways to promote neuroplasticity in your brain. It's one of the five motor activities, I should say, that only humans do. There are only 5 motor activities that the human brain can do that other vertebrates cannot, and walking upright on two limbs is one of them. And our brain is able to do it without thinking about it by age 2. So it's an amazing feat. You know, people go to the circus and the elephants, well, they probably don't do that anymore, but when they did, elephants would walk around in a circle on their hind legs and everybody would cheer and clap. And then after the circus gets over, everybody gets up and walks out and nobody thinks anything of it. But it's an amazing thing that we walk upright on two limbs. Okay. And the only reason why we can is because our brain is large enough to do it. And understand, by walking on two limbs, it allows our brain to capture more gravity. It allows our brain to enhance gravity, to enhance that stimulation, because now when we stand upright on two limbs, because the earth is spinning under our feet at 300 miles an hour, our bodies are constantly being pushed sideways. And there's little receptors in our inner ear and our spine that feel that shift of our body, and that activates our spinal muscles, our unconscious spinal muscles, to pull us in the other direction. And then once we go over our center of gravity, which is, as big as a pinhead, then we sway the other way, and it's back and forth and back and forth. And if you have a decent brain, and be careful if you try this at home, but if you stand up and put your feet together and close your eyes, if you stand still, you're swaying so fast you can't feel it. So when people stand up and put their feet together and they sway in one direction or the other, they're actually swaying slower because now I can see it with my eyes. So their brain doesn't feel the spin of the earth as quickly to pull them back in the other direction. And walking, you're really balancing, constantly switching back and forth on one leg. So it kind of makes that work even harder. And then because our head wobbles in 3 planes every time we strike our heel, that also stimulates our inner ear. And if we're looking at targets in front of us, that allows our eyes to wobble in the opposite direction, and it's just an incredibly massive stimulation to the brain. It's fabulous. So I'm a big fan of walking, but only for short durations and very frequent. So I typically recommend somewhere between 5 to 10 minute walks 5 times a day. That's my personal belief, okay? Based on my experience. Okay, so what are the other 4 things that the human brain does that my dog Puff can't do? One of them is speaking, the other is reading, and the third is writing. So these 3 things are very important in order for your brain to stay healthy. These are one of the 3 things. One of the 5, these are 3 of the 5 things that only our brain does. So very, very important. And I will tell you that reading on a screen, our brain reads differently than reading on paper. So, and there are studies to show that children who learn and read on paper and blackboards have much higher reading skills, 30% higher than children who read on screens. So if anybody wants copies of those studies, I do have them. But very important that we do read, because reading is a very specific type of brain activity, and we're looking at words. Our new brain, soaks that up. And then, of course, when it comes to writing, I'm a huge fan of cursive handwriting because it's a continuously flowing fine motor movement. And I will tell you, I'm not sure if there's therapists here or teachers on listening in, but many of the fine motor skills that children struggle with, they often have retained primitive reflexes that tend to be the main reason why they're struggling and why it seems that a lot of therapies don't seem to help them. So I would look into those, and that would be the palmar and the rooting reflexes specifically. Okay. And then, of course, sleep is very important for our brain. The American Sleep Foundation recommends that most people sleep 9 to 11 hours a day, which I don't know anybody who does. So, but most other primates in the world are our cousins of the world. That's how many hours they sleep in a day. So, but I do recommend that at least 8 hours of sleep, and the hours before midnight seem to count the most. So much better off going to bed early and then waking up earlier than going to bed later and getting up later is kind of the rule. Okay. And then the last one, of course, is delaying self-gratification. So that means eating your peas and carrots before the chocolate cake comes out. So that is a very new thing to our brain. So for that purple part of the brain, let's go back for a few seconds. So when we look at this fluffy cortex, there's basically 3 main developmental layers in this cortex. There's an archicortex, and that's associated with basic body needs and functions like sex drive and thirst and feeding and shelter, things of that nature. Then there's another layer that sits on top of that. That's the paleocortex, and that's associated with routine activities that you do, routine motor activities. They tend to be stored in that so that you can do other cognitive activities. So I can take a walk and have a conversation with somebody without thinking about swinging my right hand and my left leg and my left hand and my right leg. Those automated activities tend to be stored in that paleocortex, or that middle layer. And then we have the neocortex, the newest portion of our brain, and that's the part of our brain that's very different than other animals. So my dog Puff has a paleocortex, and the paleocortex, that emotional or behavioral activities in that is not just automated, but they also can be sad and happy. So sad and happy can also be expressed in that layer. And then, of course, the neocortex has more advanced types of behaviors and feelings, such as delaying self-gratification, having empathy for others, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, so to speak. All of those things are done in the neocortex, and especially that delay of self-gratification. That is a huge, basically you're not impulsive. Okay. And to piggyback on that a little bit, let me just see is that it? Whoops, I think that is it. Yes, that's my last slide. So to piggyback on that, understand with motor activities as well, is that there's certain basic motor activities that we all share. And again, delaying of self-gratification is holding back a motor activity. So when it comes to impulsivity and things of that nature, as I said, those are more of that paleo cortex, and then the neocortex will come down and inhibit those. So understand, as each layer grows in our brain, we all start out as a little embryo, and that's the middle portion of the brain. That's how we start out as babies. So babies have pretty much the attention span of a flea. Babies tick. They have all kinds of movement problems. They have spasticity. They're very emotional. They're very inattentive. So they start off with that little limbic brain, and then as the child grows, each new layer that comes, it inhibits the layer that comes before it. So the more layers I grow, the more inhibition my brain has. And frankly, 90% of the newest parts of our brain, that neo or new cortex, turns things off, not on. But another thing that neocortex does is it's a huge predictor. So thinking, understand, I showed you the 5 motor activities that humans do. What was the 5th one? Is making a C with my finger, my index finger and my thumb, and tapping the tip of my finger and my thumb. There are certain orangutans and chimps that can do it with their fingers, with their index finger and thumb flat, but they can't make a C and do it. It just doesn't work for them. So that's the last of the 5 things. But I really think there's a 6th, and that's the predicting portion of our brain. So predicting or thinking, frankly, is the internalization of movement, because now I can predict that movement before I do it. If we go back to the cyborg, the video that I showed you in the beginning of the lecture here, why did I show you that? Because first of all, I think it's amazing that you can take a petri dish of brain cells and teach it to fly a jet fighter in a simulator, of course, but as well as any pilot in our Air Force or our Navy. That's incredible to me. And imagine what we can do with our brains, right? So we have a lot more hardware up there than a petri dish. So understanding that even with that petri dish, what was the purpose of the petri dish's life? Is to fly the plane. That's a type of movement. So you have a brain because you move, and movement is key. And these other 4 motor activities, well, tapping your finger is probably not going to, just doing that repeatedly isn't going to help you very much. But doing that writing, that reading, and that speaking, very important for our brain. And a lot of those skills are being lost with, electronic advances today. So for sure, I think we all know that. So predicting is a huge thing. And because now our ancestors could predict the movement before they did it, a huge advancement in survivability. And, I live in New Jersey, and I often go into New York City. And whenever I'm traveling into the city and I look at the skyline, I'm always awed by the fact that I look at those buildings, and somebody one day sat down with a piece of paper and started drawing out and predicting what that building would look like, how deep the hole would have to be, how much concrete, everything. It's incredible. Boom, there it is. There's a building, and there's millions of them there. It's unbelievable to me. So thank you for having me. I hope you all learned something this evening, and I'm available for questions. I'm not sure how I do that just yet, but if anybody...
you don't have to do anything. You just have to listen here, and I'll launch the Q&A, okay? All right, so
sounds great.
Given that we're the Tourette organization, we do have a question about Tourette, so I'm going to start with that. What parts, if this is something, if you can't answer, then, let me know. So what parts of the brain are implicated in TS, and how might chiropractics help? So it's a two-part question.
Okay. So there's as the main region of the brain, and there are multiple regions of the brain that I have found with Tourette's. When I examine children who have it, they typically have areas of the cerebellum that don't work properly. And frankly, it's a loop that runs through the whole brain. I hate to just say it's the cerebellum or it's the basal ganglia, which everybody focuses on. But in the basal, so here's the loop. Messages come in from the body and they go up into the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a massive filter. If they don't go through the cerebellum and they end up in an area of the brain called the parietal lobe, then they end up filtering back to the cerebellum. So, but the main area that they seem to find in children with Tourette's, to answer your question, I don't want to get too lost here, is there's an area of the basal ganglia called the subthalamic nucleus. And it would appear, at least in my experience, that it's the entrance and exit loops, or that nucleus itself, that seem to be the problem with these children. But understand that there's also, their frontal lobes are typically underdeveloped. It's typically usually on one side more than the other. I typically find the right side is underdeveloped. And then typically the left cerebellum, which attaches to that side, is underdeveloped. And, it's not that, as you hopefully learned from my lecture tonight, it's not that they can't be developed. They just have to be very specifically developed because of those certain weak pathways. I hope I answered that question.
Okay, so part two then of how might chiropractics help, then that would be in assisting with the development?
Well, that would be with stimulating the other entrance and exit loops into the subthalamic nucleus. So adjustments would be one of those. I find that children who get adjusted a specific way do very well. But understand that's not the only thing I do, because I find these children have difficulties holding their eyes still. So that's another region of the brain in the cerebellum, or in the basal ganglia, in the upper brain stem. That green portion, the mesencephalon in there, those neurons that hold our eyes still on targets are in there. And so it's not just one area, it's multiple areas. So I use a combination of adjustments and certain environmental stimulations. It could be sound, it could be light, it could be eye movements, whatever I find that makes them more stable in gravity and makes those eyes, and basically it slows the tics down.
So when you say eye movement, you're not talking there about tics per se. You're talking about some other kind of eye movement.
No, the eye movements that I'm talking about would be eye exercises.
Okay. All right. But when you're saying that their eyes aren't steady, you're still referring there to a particular situation, not that they're unsteady because of tics.
Correct. Although some children have tics in their eyes, that's correct.
Sure. Yep.
I find that in some of these children, not when they're ticking at all, but just in general, when I do certain, I look at how their eyes move, because that's part of knowing where you are in space. So that's very important to me. I find that in certain, how can I put it, in certain areas of gaze, in certain directions they look, they have more difficulties than others. And
okay.
so that can alone. So therefore, if you notice, in other words, I can arrest a tic sometimes, and this isn't in all of them, but this is just an example. Sometimes I can arrest a tic by having them gaze in one direction and make it worse gazing in another. So the eyes are involved with that.
Okay.
Because the eyes are involved in knowing where we are in space. Again, it comes back to that.
All right. There was this lady with the question said she didn't quite catch something you said, so she's asking for a little clarification. that you said something about reflexes remaining longer than they should. And I have to say, I couldn't tell you what slide you were on when you were talking about that, but the question is, what is that an indication of? About reflexes remaining longer than they should.
So all of us are born with primitive reflexes. So when we're born, and let's say you're born at a hospital, the doctor will pull the baby aside and do a neurological exam. It's called an APGAR test. And what they're looking for are primitive reflexes, and basically they're checking to see if the baby's brain has developed normally to that point in time. So they do usually a series of about 10 tests. So one of them would be they'll stroke the cheek of the baby and see if they'll turn their head and open their mouth to nurse. That's called a rooting reflex. Another example would be they'll touch the palm and the baby will close their hand on the finger. That's called a palmar reflex. So I have found that children with fine motor difficulties tend to retain that reflex. So it's normal for an infant to have this, but it should be suppressed by age 2. And what suppresses the primitive reflexes are they're replaced with postural reflexes. So a child first learns to walk or starting around age 1, between age 1 and 2. And by age 2, they pretty much mastered it. So in the beginning, they'll see a piece of furniture and they'll take a step or two to get there. And then they kind of look around and see, hey, mommy, did you see what I just did? That was so cool. And then by the time they're 2, they're not thinking about taking first steps or taking steps. They're chasing their Tonka truck down the hallway. So posture reflexes replace these baby primitive reflexes. And I have found that when children and adults, I see them in adults as well, retain these, then especially the palmar and the rooting reflex, then they tend to have fine motor difficulties. Because when they hold a pencil in their hand is going into a palmar reflex instead of pointing their fingers to do a nice pencil hold. So these are kids who hold their pencil like a fist. And that's the palmar reflex. If you see it in a baby, they hold them just like a baby would hold the finger. So, and there are exercises you can do to get rid of those, and it helps tremendously with fine motor. Tremendously.
So you would see that, just curious, you would see that type of gripping as an adult. I mean, then that almost becomes, that's how they learn to do it, and it's really difficult to change then, I would think, in terms of writing that way.
No question, no question. You'll see people who, they kind of hold a fork with the fork sticking out between their thumb and their index finger when they're eating. I mean, that's a palmar. They just never learned to hold a fork properly because they never suppressed that reflex. And understand, too, that to piggyback on all parts of the brain are born in the same day and linked together till the day you die, understand, if you have children, you can't get more emotional than a baby. Babies have they wake up from their nap, man, they want that bottle immediately. They want to eat, and they're screaming till they get it. So if people retain motor activities of a baby, they're also going to retain some of those behavioral activities as well. And whenever I see them out adults in my office, I'll turn to the spouse and say, is he or she emotional? And I always get a giggle or a laugh because they already know the answer. Of course they are. Because you can't get more emotional than a baby. And if you retain motor activities, you retain cognitive, behavioral, and sensory as well.
So just to carry that one more point, at what age, using that grip, like the kid's grip with the fork or the spoon or whatever, I have an almost 3-year-old grandson, so I'm curious now, at what stage should that be diminished or, go away?
Suppressed.
What age are we talking about? Suppressed, thank you.
All primitive reflexes should be suppressed by age 2.
Okay, I have to see him this weekend and see how he's holding.
I mean, I could give a whole talk just on primitive reflexes alone because they're so important in children in childhood problems. So important.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was
maybe
really
for the next time.
Next time, yeah. All right, so let's see. So there's a question about movement in the brain. And so does that explain why children with ADHD have such a hard time staying still? And if so, could there be any benefit for children with ADHD to have chiropractic adjustments? What's your experience in working with ADHD or attention deficit even as an adult in that?
Okay. I will put it to you this way. In my experience, all of the children, I've seen many children on the spectrum, hundreds if not thousands over the years. Okay. And in my experience, and it doesn't matter how bad they are, I've seen some, pretty low functioning children and adults for that matter that just were this way their whole lives. They all behave normally. Their behavior is normal for how they perceive their world. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we all behave based on how we perceive our world and our situation in our daily lives. They're no different. So I believe that their behavior is normal based on how they perceive their world. And so I don't treat behavioral problems. I refer all those people out, but yet I have a huge effect on behavior in my practice for the reasons I gave you with embryology today. That, the way I have changed people's behavior, I've gotten children to talk who never talked before in their teens. And the reason how is because, frankly, especially the kids who've talked, they really all knew how to talk. They just never saw the need because how they perceive the world, it's not necessary. That's the way I've seen it. I remember I had one child, the first words he ever said was, "Hey, Pop, that sign says bank." First thing the kid ever said. Now, that doesn't sound like a kid who can't talk. So he knew how to talk. He just never saw the need. He never had the need. So to answer your question, I find with ADHD kids, they don't perceive the world the way, I don't want to say the rest of us because we all have issues, including me. There's no such thing as a perfect brain. But what I find the main thing with those children is that they cannot hold their eyes still. So if their eyes are in motion, they're in motion. That's just it. They cannot hold their eyes still. So I've given many lectures to schools and things, and often I get, at the end of the lecture, like we're doing now, somebody will raise their hand and say, "Hey, how do I know my kid with ADHD needs to come see you?" And I typically will tell them, hold your child's head straight in front of you, hold their face out in front of you at arm's reach, and then have them look at your nose and turn their head back and forth with your hands while they look at your nose. If they can do it and their eyes don't jump around, they probably don't need me. And inevitably, I get at least 5 or 10 calls the next week. "Dr. Kiechlin, he can do it in one direction. He cannot do it no matter how many times I tried. He can't do it in the other direction." And again, if you have shaky eyes in one direction, not the other, then your perception of where you are in space is skewed. And then everything else about you is going to be skewed. Your motor, your cognition, your behavior, everything. That's why I named the lecture, "I Wasn't Aware." Who talks about this stuff? I mean, not many people.
Okay.
But it's so important.
Okay, thank you. And that
Hope
was
I
a
answered that.
good, yeah, I think that was a fine explanation. Thank you. You talked about walking, and I'm pretty sure you said walking 10 minutes 5 times a day. Was that it?
Yes,
or maybe
that's
the wrong? Okay.
That's what I personally like to do.
Okay.
Me personally, and go ahead.
So the question then relates to just a couple of questions about that process. So if it's 10 minutes approximately 5 times a day, I would assume that this is not power walking we're doing here. You're not counting calories and trying to get your steps in for some calorie counting thing. So would you just talk about that a little bit? At least that was my assumption based on what you said, but I could be wrong. So just, fine
Sure,
tune
I'd be
that a
glad
little bit
to.
for me.
It comes down to fatigability. So I'll tell you a little story. 20 years ago, my father passed away from cancer. And at the time, I only had an office in Princeton, and I was driving up to a hospital in North Jersey to stay with him because I knew he was dying. So I was doing this every night for, 8 or 9 months. So there wasn't much to eat on the way to the hospital other than fast food. And 8 hours later, I haven't eaten since noon. I'm starving. So I would often stop, and it was what was there. It was what was there to eat. So I had gained a tremendous amount of weight over those 9 months, about 40 pounds. So after my father passed away, I went to his cardiologist, and when they weighed me in, I knew my pants were tight, but I couldn't believe I gained 40 pounds. I almost had a heart attack in the guy's office. So I had just read that jumping up and down on a trampoline 2 weeks earlier. I had read that jumping up and down on a trampoline was equal to running 3 miles, or it was equal to running a mile. Jumping up and down a trampoline for 3 minutes was equal to running a mile. So I thought, awesome, I'm getting one of these, and I'm going to lose this weight. I'm going to just jump up and down between patients, and this weight will fall off me. So
How'd that go?
Well, here it comes. So I buy this very expensive trampoline. It comes with this 45-minute video of this guy that when, you saw him doing it, you're like, yeah, I want to look like him. So I start off with the 10-minute health bounce, and in 3 days, I could barely walk. I was so out of shape. To a point where I had a patient say to me, I was limping so bad. She said to me, Dr. Kiechlin, you're not going to fall on me when you adjust me, are you? So at that point, I said, that's it. I can't use this trampoline, and I'm 40 pounds fat now. So I had just taken my first neurology seminar, and I remember thinking, okay, what would I do if I was my own patient? And a lot of what I taught you tonight, I learned in my first seminar. So I thought, okay, what's the rule? Frequent stimulation for short duration is what changes the brain the most. So I thought, if I can't walk 10 minutes at 30-something years old, then I'm going to pack it in, and I'm going to do it 5 times a day. And I didn't miss a walk for 3 months, and I lost that weight in 3 months. So to answer your cardiology question, yes, I don't want to do it. Should be a rhythmical walk, not a power walk. And don't be surprised, especially if you don't miss the frequency of the walks, that you shed pounds like crazy doing it the way I'm recommending.
So ideally then that 10 minutes 5 times a day is, it's almost an hour.
It's 50 minutes of walking a day.
Yeah.
And you're never going to fatigue your brain cells where they go into survival mode. They just keep making more protein and getting stronger and stronger. And walking is my super equalizer for many things. I make most patients in my practice walk.
Okay, so I have a question about dementia. So what, if any, is there a track record of chiropractic neurology in the treatment of dementia?
There is. It really depends on, so much of that depends on the health of the patient, because usually dementia, it occurs in older people. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of other cofactors that can be related to it. There's a lot of sugar issues with these people. So if they're diabetic, that has a huge effect on the brain. If their arterial system isn't healthy, there's a lot of plaquing, or their heart just isn't strong enough to push the blood up into the brain, then, that can affect whether you have success or not. But understand that as long as it's not a degenerative type of dementia, then, it's just a matter of using your brain. I will tell you this, that in one of my practices, I have about maybe, at least at one time, I had about 6 or 8 CEOs under my care who are all in their 80s. And they were all gentlemen. They all still, in their 80s, ran their companies. And they ran them. They were not figureheads. And they were the boss. And Um, I think that because they never retired at 65, they were so sharp into their they just never quit. They never stopped working. So I think if you want to prevent dementias, you better use your brain. And then as far as if somebody who has one, you know, it would really, it's a very, for something like dementia, it would be a very individual case. But yes, there are things that can be done because chiropractic neurology promotes neuroplasticity in the brain.
Mm-hmm. Could
So
you?
I will tell
Oh.
you this to answer that a little bit better. Many times I get phone calls from people, from parents often, with children who are on the spectrum and who are very low functioning, and they'll want to know, can you help my child? And I never know until I examine them anyway, but I'll ask them, can your child learn? And I'll say, and they'll pause, like, what do you mean? Can they learn? I mean anything. And then they'll tell me, they'll go through usually a quick laundry list of, oh yes, he can do this, he can do that, blah 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 blah. And I'm like, then I'll probably have some success, but I won't know for sure till I examine them. And then a lot of that has to do with it. Do I think the kid's gonna, cooperate? Does he, rapport with children is so important in my business. They
Sure.
have to like me, or I'll never get anywhere with them.
Okay.
And be
Along that.
comfortable with me.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Along the same idea of the dementia, that's kind of produced a question now on Parkinson's in terms of your experience. In terms of the issues with the brain with Parkinson's. Would you comment on that, or is that pretty much what you've already discussed in the dementia piece?
No, Parkinson's is a little bit different because Parkinson's actually starts in your gut. The first sign of Parkinson's is constipation. And so it affects the nerve plexus in your gut first, and then it tends to migrate up into the nose, so they often will lose smell, and up into the upper brain stem, and then eventually to the cerebral cortex, and that's when they become demented. So there are lots of people with Parkinson's who are diagnosed with it, who have the tremors, so to speak, and that sort of thing, but they're not demented. So it's not necessarily, usually the ones that live a long time tend to become demented. But as far as Parkinson's, unfortunately, Parkinson's, at least from my understanding, is a fatal disease. It's if you have it, you can slow it down tremendously. That I've been able to do in a lot of people. But it tends to be over time a fatal disease. But there's a lot you can do to help them with, especially with balance and movement. And then of course, if you can get them to balance and move, then they start walking, and then bada bing, then everything starts to kick in again. And remember, with Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's is a disease that we earn. You don't see children with Parkinson's. It happens in older people. So again, not being exposed to toxic environments and things like that. So if somebody has it and it tends to run in their families, which not all Parkinson's does, but some does, then you always want to lead a clean life and stay away from things that might trigger it or express that gene.
Okay, thank you. We've gone over, but I'm going to wrap it with just one more question, okay? And this has to do with your expertise in your area of chiropractic neurology. And the question is, what bearing, if any, does it have, or could it have, on anxiety? So I'm assuming this is a kind of a generalized anxiety disorder because it wasn't stipulated here. But if you could just talk about treatment or how anxiety plays in this.
Absolutely. So in my experience, and I've only picked this up on observation from seeing, I see a large amount of patients who come to me or have balance difficulties and vertigo. So a lot of them. And what I have found over the years of seeing so many of these people is that, and these are people who've had concussions and things of that nature, but at the, so they get it for all different reasons. But what I noticed and I've observed is that they all have a history of anxiety. So when I fix their vertigo or their dizziness or their balance or whatever they have, their anxiety disappeared as well. And it has happened so many times in my practice that, and I have no way to prove this, I can't find a study yet to show it, but it's been my experience that anxiety is a type of vertigo. You just don't have it so bad that you feel the spin, but you have all the other things, the rapid heart rate, the sweating, the panic attack of somebody who has vertigo, who's having a vertigo attack. I mean, and it's been so, to me, anxiety is an expression of a type of vertigo. It's almost like a fear of heights, a fear of driving through a tunnel, a fear of driving over bridges, all of those things, in my opinion, are a type of vertigo. You don't know where you are in space, and your brain is freaking out about it. So I have found in my experience that, I'll put it to you this way, I've never seen anybody who had a history of anxiety that didn't have a problem with their balance systems to some degree. Never seen that. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay. All right. And you know what? I have one more question that, so this is my last one. Okay.
Sure.
This has to do with concussion. And I think it's you touched on concussion, and I think it's one that is important to families as it relates to sports that their kids participate in and so forth. So the question has to do with, number one, what is referred to as the longevity of the after effects of a concussion. And there's a part two to it. Is it reasonable to think that someone would still have poor school performance as much as a year later?
Absolutely. I've seen it much longer than that. I've seen it 3 or 4 years later, and they are still suffering. And the research is now showing that with concussions, there's a two-part to it. When you bang your head, because your head is attached to your trunk through your neck, and the way the joints in your neck are aligned and shaped, that if you bend your head sideways or turn your head, your neck pretty much will always move in 3 planes. So, and it doesn't really matter where or how the head hits. I mean, it does. In other words, it matters in how much that it twists and moves in one specific plane, but it always moves in multiple planes. And what they're finding is that when people have concussions, they tend to have problems with the inner ear and all the parts of the brain that the inner ear goes to. Well, what are those? Those are the coordination systems of your eyes, neck, and head movements. So if you have so understand the way this system is wired, and this is normally on all of us, is that, for instance, the inner ear, if I tilt my head to the right, my right inner ear, let's say, is going down 5 degrees, but my left inner ear is going up 5 degrees, almost like an airplane on a wing. If I bank the plane to the right 5 degrees, the wing on the left is going up the exact amount, 5 degrees, but in the opposite direction. And we're all wired that way normally. So when somebody bangs their head, the shock wave through the skull is pretty much almost the same force throughout the whole skull, because there's some fat in the bone, but it's pretty much a solid structure. So that shock wave is moving through the whole skull, and the inner ear system is embedded in the bone of your skull. So it takes that shock wave. And so what I'm trying to say is that when those balance systems go off, then the plane starts to permanently tilt in one direction. And then as one side goes up, the other side gets suppressed more over time. So I'll put it to you this way to hopefully answer the question. When it comes to concussions, and I haven't seen one yet where this system wasn't affected to some degree, as one side goes up, the other side gets suppressed, and vice versa. So if your head gets whacked and tilted and it's stuck in a tilt, so to speak, that tilt tends to perpetuate itself, and they just get weaker and weaker and weaker over time. And most vestibular therapies that are performed tend to get the strong side to do the work of both sides. So now my strong side that isn't affected so much can do the work of the weak side. The only problem with that is if you get a secondary concussion and you whack your good side, then now you don't have any side to work with. And these are why secondary concussions especially can be so devastating, and why people often, the first concussion they'll recover in 4 to 6 weeks. Second concussion, they're still out for 2 years, 3 years or more. I've seen more. I've seen longer than a year. So,
Wow.
so I hope that answers
Okay.
the question. I hope I explained why.
Thank you. And I'm going to definitely turn this back over to Kelly for a wrap up. Thank you for a really, really informative presentation. Kelly, you
Thank you
can
for
take it
having
from
me.
here. You're welcome.
Thank you all for joining our webinar on I Wasn't Aware, Brain Function and Why Do We Have a Brain? There is an exit survey which we need everyone attending to fill out. The webinar blog is open and now available for the next 7 days on the NJCTS website for any additional questions that were not covered in tonight's presentation. That website is www.njcts.org. Also, an archived version of tonight's webinar will be posted to the site. Our next presentation, An Introduction to Mindfulness for Stress Reduction, will be presented by Dr. Anton Shcherbakov and is scheduled for January 15th, 2020. This ends tonight's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Kiechlin, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us. Good night.
Thank you for having me.